This week's episode of our show is sponsored by the Vagabond's Guide to Dauriata, which is coming very soon to Kickstarter.
This 300-page book is inspired by the Celtic folklore of Scotland and Ireland and is actually named after the early medieval kingdom that stretched between Scotland and Ireland.
And because Kelly and I can actually trace some of our ancestry to these places, we were very, very excited to see all the references to mythology and history that are in this book in the form of the deities, magic items, subclasses, and the monsters that are found within it. I was so excited to see things like leprechauns and the Green Knight, but also some really deep cuts and references to some of my favorite mythological tales in there.
Not only can you play as a leprechaun, as well as a few other species that are based on Irish sort of folklore, but also we have banshees, we have bagpipes, and we have a whole bunch of whiskey in this book as well. There's actually an adventure included if you back the Kickstarter called The Battle of Carrigarth, which lets you face up against Morrigan and her army of undead. All of this speaks to my heart so much.
Yes.
with all of my favorite folklore growing up. So there's over 20 new monsters. There's tons of magic items. This book is absolutely full of all of the Scottish, Irish, Celtic vibes that you could want to bring to a D&D game.
So check the link in the description below to get it on the Kickstarter while it's live.
And now, on to this week's episode.
Greetings, my name's Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we are once again diving into the latest 1D&D playtest packet. This one focusing on the Druid and the Paladin.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
The Druid and the Paladin are probably two of the strongest classes in 5e, wouldn't you say?
I would say yes. The Druid is one of the most versatile spellcasters in the game. They can be a tank, they can be a primary spellcaster, they can do a lot of damage, they can do a lot of battlefield control. They have a lot going for them. And then when you talk about Paladins in 5th edition, I've seen Paladins dish out the most damage in the entire game by landing a smite, a high-level smite on a Demon Lord.
Yeah.
It's pretty insane. Plus, they bolster the whole party. So, did they need a nerf? Maybe.
I think that this is a great chance for us to see where the power level of the game is going to fall. Or perhaps where the design team is thinking of taking it. And so with the revisions in this packet, I think there's a lot to say, and I think that maybe we'll start with the Paladin because we have less to say.
Yes.
I
will also say that in reading this document, I've learned something very important about myself. And for those who have been watching the channel for a long time, you might know this about Monty and I as well and be able to call us out on this. And that is, after reading this document, my first instinct was to be upset and angry at everything. Then I started questioning, am I a power gamer? Not in like the negative way. Like I don't go out of my way to power game, but I enjoy feeling powerful in my games of D&D. And I think I'm very biased in the fact that a lot of my anger was like, well, these aren't as powerful as they used to be. And I think that's the point. I still have some issues that I'm going to bring up with them, but I had to start to question whether maybe I'm just wanting things to keep pushing power level when maybe backtracking is the correct choice, and that I shouldn't be so begrudging of these changes just because they're squashing some of the ultimate power moves I can pull off.
Well, speaking of ultimate power moves that you can pull off, let's talk about the big thing that they've changed with the Paladin in this playtest packet, and that is fundamentally Divine Smite. The biggest change to this is that Divine Smite, it still uses spell slots, still does roughly the same amount of damage, but you can only do it once per turn now, and you can't do it on the same turn as you cast a spell. This is a big change, because one of the things that was previously possible with a Paladin is that you could smite on every single attack, and not only could you use Divine Smite on every single attack, it's actually possible in the current 5th edition rules to combine Divine Smite with the Smite spells to land a uber mega smite. This is no longer possible. And this restriction is a pretty specific and targeted way of lowering the Nova potential of the Paladin.
And I think that's where this was the case where I had to check myself. Because at first I said, how dare you take away my ability to uber smite my demon lord? But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this is actually pretty good.
I mean, it is deliberately putting the brakes on you, because if you look at it in an absolute sense, the smiting on every single attack was always a massive use of resources for the paladin. You would, if you had Great Weapon Master and you had, say, Polearm Master and could attack 3 times in a turn, and you use 3 of your spell slots. Well, for most paladins, that would be like using a third of your spell slots, sometimes even a half of your spell slots in a single turn. And so it does kind of force you to apply the brakes in that respect, because you can still smite with all your spell slots. You just can't blow them all in one turn. I think that this is probably healthy for the game, although I question the spell casting restriction.
Well, I think it's to stop you from using the smite spell in combination, but also, are we getting many smite spells?
Well,
we haven't really seen anything on that.
This is my feeling on the matter. I've heard a lot of people talk about how they do not like that the smite spells are, because of the way the spell lists have become generic in D&D, in 1D&D, clerics have access to Find Steed and the smite spells. And I've heard a lot of people comment on how this takes away of a lot of the uniqueness from the paladin. And I do agree.
Yeah.
I don't think that clerics should gain access to the smite spells, and I don't think that they should gain access to Find Steed. And so I think making the smite spells and making Find Steed, there's basically, as far as I'm concerned, there's 2 approaches to this. Bring back unique spell lists. Actually, please. Like, I think unique spell lists for each class is cool. It's thematic. It's flavorful. It's meaningful. I don't necessarily like the generic spell list, and I think that this is the clearest reason why they shouldn't be a thing. The alternative to this is don't make any of the smite spells at all, and make the smite spells some sort of different feature that the paladin can select and use in a similar manner, as well as Find Steed, make them baked into the class as unique and choosable abilities.
I mean, I think what's interesting is when you look at the Paladin in the playtest document, they went 75% of the way there of making Find Steed a class feature.
Yes.
But they said, you get the spell. Why don't they just give them an ability that lets them summon a spectral steed? Don't let anybody else have access to that spell. It feels like it's supposed to be a paladin spell. Mm-hmm. You could have a selection of smites that you could apply onto your character. It's like, I choose the fire smite or the lightning smite or the shadow smite. Like, you get to pick which type of smite spell your paladin acquires. I think that we're most of the way there. Why not just bake it in?
Yeah, we're just in this middle ground where I think that both of these options would work. Again, the unique spell lists would be a great solution, or making the smites not spells, but some sort of other feature. Potentially, the smite spells could be the paladins could use their channel divinity power to activate their smites. And I feel like there's not a lot that paladins can do with channel divinity beyond what they get from their subclass. So that could be a way of approaching it, but that would then really limit the number of times a paladin could smite. On the flip side, maybe that's what we want for game balance, and we want the smites to be something that maybe a paladin only uses once or twice in a combat encounter, but it has a really big impact. Or is it more fun for a paladin to smite every turn because that's fun? And I do think that that's, it's a very valid thing, is that I feel like a paladin when I'm smiting. Yeah. And so I want to be able to smite multiple times in a combat encounter and not feel like I have to really hold back on that all the time. So I go one of those 2 ways with this.
Buffing my allies, wearing heavy armor, riding a cool horse, and smiting bad guys. That's what I want. And we're limiting part of that.
Were you surprised that they didn't nerf Aura of Protection?
I I mean, again, power gamer mentality. I wasn't surprised because I was too busy being like, good.
It's been bumped to 7th level, so it's a bit more difficult to access by 1 level.
By 1 level,
Yeah.
which, okay, you now need to take 7 levels of Paladin to gain that. I do think that, like, when we're talking about things that make the Paladin feel like a Paladin, the Aura of Protection is the other part. Any game that I've played that had a Paladin-like character has a buff aura. That's like a vibe that Paladins have. And so I'm glad it's not going anywhere. I'm glad it's still there. We're also getting cantrips now as a Paladin.
Yes, which is, we kind of expected that because they did that with the Ranger as well. So there could be a very interesting Paladin build that is more of a caster Paladin. Now, again, depending on what kind of attack cantrips become available to the Paladin. Once again, this could be a case of maybe the Paladin has a unique spell list and doesn't get the things like Toll the Dead and Sacred Flame. On the flip side, if Paladins do have cantrips, wow, them having Guidance and bringing Guidance and Bless and Aura of Protection, that's a pretty good suite of party support. Like, that really keys them up in terms of the support package that they bring.
I think overall with the Paladin, I'm not really disappointed, and it kind of just, I feel like there's some finessing that needs to happen, some massaging. I'm not shocked by them nerfing smites. At first I was not happy, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like that brings Paladin down to like where everybody else is hanging out.
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways from this is that overall, aside from the Nova thing, I think I was very happy with the Paladin class. And I would rather see the Paladin be the sort of the standard by which all other classes in the game are judged.
Yeah.
It's a strong class. It might be the best class in the game, depending on... my answer to that's going to vary on what side of the bed I woke up on today.
Yeah.
But it really does have a lot of strengths to it. And because it is such a strong, all-around, powerful class as a tank, damage dealer, support character, it's worth looking at it very closely and saying, okay, are other classes offering as much as the Paladin does to the player experience? And so I like that it hasn't changed as much because it lets us continue to ask that question by comparison.
And I think while we're talking about support characters, the other half of this document is about the Druid. And the Druid, I think we have a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
The literal elephant in the room is going to be the discussion on Wild Shape. Mm-hmm. Do we want to talk about any other features before we dive into Wild Shape?
I really don't have a lot to say about the other changes to the Druid because I feel like, first of all, I think that Wild Shape as just overshadows everything else. It's the biggest thing to discuss. Sure, there's some tweaks here and there. Once again, I'll also say I'm not a huge fan of the new spellcasting preparation thing. I still don't like it. I still want the spells to be prepare as many as equal to your level and not this weird step back to what it was in 3rd edition. Again, if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be, but I still don't like it.
We do have the channel nature feature now. So that's one kind of difference is instead of like you get 2 wild shapes, you have channel nature, which is sort of like channel divinity for clerics or paladins. And channel nature, you get a certain amount. It's on like the spell progression chart. You get more as you level up. Which means that we have this opportunity with the Druid that I actually do like. I like channel nature. We're going to start with my favorite thing in this document, and then we're going to go into everything I'm angry about. Channel nature, great. Love it. Great design choice. And it opens up this avenue for us to make more druidic features beyond wild shape that let us use our channel nature feature as we're moving up to being able to use it 4, 5, 6 times. Having higher level features that use channel nature, I think is really cool. I love this design.
I also think putting it on the table and not tying it to the proficiency bonus is the right design choice. One of the things that I kind of am noticing in this 1D&D as a sub-theme is trying to reduce how much the classes are front-loaded. And part of that is decoupling uses and the strength of abilities from the proficiency bonus. There were a lot of features that were introduced, particularly in Xanathar's and Tasha's, where the number of uses of that ability was tied to the proficiency bonus, which meant that you could dip into the class and then get the full uses of that, even though you'd only taken 3 levels of the class. This reversal is healthy for kind of clamping down on the strength of multiclassing, because 5th edition's multiclassing system is always going to be this thing that hangs over all of the design of the game. And I felt like I noticed this really particularly even in developing our own stuff for Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakkenheim, where you had this problem in 5th edition where you have to be careful about the cool feature that you give a class early on that defines that class. Because if you want to give a cool feature early, now it's like, oh, I'm just going to snipe that with multiclassing and combine that with this other thing. And so immediately you have to think about basically all the 3rd level features. You have to think about what happens if you have a level 6 character that has 2 of them. And it's actually a very large constraint on what you can do with the design of the game. And it's for this reason, like, I totally understand why there's not multiclassing like this in 4th edition and Pathfinder 2nd edition, because it is such a challenging design problem to have to deal with. And yeah, like, it's like you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have this flexible multiclassing system and also it's hard. It's really hard to overcome. And so the wild shape feature has to be written in such a way that it's bad when you multiclass with it. Yeah.
Well, speaking of wild shape, let's get into it. So with wild shape, what we've done is we've removed the core mechanic of wild shape, which was that you could change into any beast of a certain challenge rating found in the monster manual. Had to be a beast. And as you gain levels, you got a higher challenge rating and you got access to aquatic and aerial forms. What they've done instead is they've given you 3 stat blocks that unlock as you level up. First, you get your Beast of the Land form. So then you get your Beast of the Sea, and then you get your Beast of the Sky. 3 different stat blocks. They level up. They scale as you level up. You unlock each of them as you level up. And one of the major things that has changed is previously in 5th edition, Druids were notorious for being damage sponges because you could turn into a bear and all of a sudden you have 100 and whatever hit points, and then when that's reduced, you revert back to your regular form, still with all of your hit points in your regular form. That's a lot of extra hit points on the board. In 1D&D, you don't gain any additional hit points when you transform. You still have your normal amount of hit points. This is interesting. Again, trying to squash my love of power in the games of D&D. I understand why these changes are being made, and I actually appreciate most of them. My problem is that if you ask me to name my favorite moments that I have seen in my D&D games with a druid character, whether I was playing it, whether it was playing at my table, or I was playing alongside one, none of those stories are possible anymore with the druid the way that it's written here. I'm thinking of times that Kyle transformed into a giant spider to ride under the bottom of a bridge with, I think, like one of our characters was a halfling riding on his back, so that the halfling could like stick bombs using webbing to the underside of a bridge. I'm thinking of times that we ran into a room on a giant scorpion and pinched 2 enemies to hold them in place while the rest of us all jumped around fighting. There was octopus shenanigans happening. There was a bunch of giant spiders climbing things. That was a regular thing.
But also druids spying on entire fortresses as a squirrel or a spider. And a bunch of shenanigans involving a boar.
Yeah.
Which we won't go into the details of.
Excellent session.
Although And I think part of what made Wild Shape so interesting and fun was that there was a lot of different animals that you could transform into, and it was an adaptable feature that could be applied in interesting and creative ways. The character could choose the form that was appropriate for the environment or the situation at hand, and gain a useful power or ability that was interesting in that moment. By having only 3 stat blocks that vary only in very superficial ways. Fundamentally, the beast of the land gets a multi-attack and a climb speed, and a keen sense feature. The beast of the sea can swim, and the beast of the sky can fly. So the only meaningful difference between most of these, in terms of what is going to change how your character plays, is their speeds, essentially. We're not able to become a tiny creature until level 11. And the character is actually incidentally able to become a large creature right away. You can choose that size. There's not a big difference in the armor class between these forms. It's pretty small, and it's still using your own hit points. So the wild shape form is not that impressive in terms of what it offers you anymore. And there's not a lot of diversity, or there's no unique powers or abilities there. In principle, I think that this design addresses 2 of the biggest issues with wild shape successfully. That being the massive residual pool of hit points that chaining wild shapes together resulted in, which I do agree was a balance problem that needed to be fixed. The second thing that it also addresses is the wonky scaling that wild shape had by giving the player the ability to crack open the monster manual and choose a form from the monster manual, and in some cases choose forms that were not intended for them to use. I actually felt that there was a constraint placed on the designers of 5th edition to not create new beasts stat blocks in monster books, because if you did, you would be giving a new form for a druid to potentially turn into. And so I do think that not having the players going to the monster manual looking for hundreds of different potential wild shape forms, I think that's a good thing. I think squishing it down to 3 forms is a massive mistake and an oversimplification that is going way too far. Some have suggested that the wild shape forms should have a variety of different abilities that the player can pick from in a smorgasbord fashion. And I think that would be kind of cool, although that might feel like more that the druid is a mutant rather than changing into animal forms. And so what I would like to propose is the following. Give us 12 to 20 stat blocks. Make them things like the ursine form for bears, the equine form for horses, the canine and the lupine forms for dogs and wolves. Give us an arachnid form, a feline form, a reptilian, maybe a serpentine, maybe a cephalopod, or a piscine, or an amphibious form. I can, off the top of my head, we'll put them on screen. I thought of like 12 of these. Give each of them a unique power. So the arachnid form has webs. The insectoid form has mandibles or pincers. The canine form or the lupine form has a trip attack. The feline form is good at stealth and can pounce. Whatever feels iconic for that animal as a single feature, make them a scaling stat block. Maybe have a rodent form so we can be the squirrel again. And then, here's my hot take. The druid has a limited number of forms known.
I think that this makes sense. I think that even when I played a druid, and I had the whole monster manual at my disposal, I generally had 3 or 4 that were my go-to. When Kyle was playing a druid, he notoriously was either the giant spider, the bear, the octopus, or the scorpion. Those were his forms. And so a lot of people steer towards specific forms. So I think, we have the 12 to 20 stat blocks. Certain ones are level locked. The aerial ones and the water ones are locked until you reach certain levels. And you have a scaling amount that increases as you level up.
Start at 3, and maybe by the end of the character's career, somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 10 different forms. You can retrain them as you level up. and some of them can be level locked. And that also means that Druid subclasses could give you access to specific, more powerful forms. So maybe it's the Moon Druid gives you access to dire versions or giant versions of all these animals. We could have an elementalist Druid that has the fire elemental form, or that could be the Moon Druid thing, but I actually feel like it'd be cooler if there was a separate elemental one.
You open up so many options for new subclasses where you could have a subclass focused on being a Druid of the wolves. Who like gains additional lupin forms and bonuses to those forms. You could really go a lot of different ways by building it that way. Now, this is us homebrewing.
Yeah.
But I do think that is... It's still solving the problems that obviously 1D&D wants to solve. And I do agree that they need to be solved, like you said. And we're making progress. But the big mistake that they've made is they've taken away the creativity from the Druid. And we need to put it back in.
Yes, with some constraints, because I do think that Wild Shape was a very powerful and a very overwhelming feature. And having spoken to some of our patrons and a few other people, there's a lot of bookkeeping often associated with it. But I do think we want that diversity. We want more than 3 choices overall. But if the player has to say, okay, hey, there's 20 different animal forms, but you as a Druid master 3 of them. I think that's thematic as well. Like there's something about the idea that the Druid has to have an attunement of some kind to certain animal forms. There's a storytelling element to that I quite like. And it does put a restriction on it, because that way as a Druid you have to decide, okay, am I going to go for the really powerful exploration ones, the really powerful combat ones? And it does allow that specialization too, because it does mean the flying forms can be balanced by the fact that they let you fly, but they're not necessarily the best for combat, right? And so there can be forms that now the Druid has to choose that form for the exploration benefits versus its combat benefits. You still get enough choices that you can have a nice mixture, but you can't have it all. And I think that that's a really good balancing factor. It's like, have a lot of choices, but, you can only have so many slices of cake. I wonder if maybe the designers of 1D&D are avoiding it because, yes, it will look like they just copied Pathfinder 2nd Edition's homework, because that's what PF2E does.
But if it's working, why not?
I mean, I do think that the precedent was established. Like, a precedent has always been established by a lot of different role-playing games of having this kind of selectable item, because really, when you look at it, the fighter from 3rd edition that got a feat every other level was kind of the prototype for that sort of idea. And then that kind of fell into its own again with the way that classes worked in 4th edition, and you saw it a lot more in things like the Warlock and the Artificer, who do get these choices to make as they level up.
I mean, even when we look at 5th edition, this isn't unusual. We've seen our favorite fighter subclass is the Battlemaster, who has a list of options to choose from. I think that we've talked many times about, not at the same time we haven't talked about this, but it's come out in our many episodes, that we love a subclass that is focused on an idea, but that has versatility within that idea, so that you both get your exact fantasy that you're playing into with the subclass, but you also get diversity and choice.
I think that people do want this idea where there's a choice that you get to make for your character at every level, right? And I think about even quite recently when we've leveled up our characters in our 5th edition games of like, hey, Kelly, what did your rogue get at 13th level?
It's an ability. I got and it doesn't sound as cool as when Joe's like, oh, I get to choose an invocation and 2 new spells. And I'm like, oh, what did you pick? And then I'm like, I got this text right here. Yeah. So. And I think that that's kind of one of those things that we lost somewhere along the way of wanting to have this thing. And it is a balancing factor, right? Like, how much bookkeeping, how much building do you want to have? And I feel like 5th edition's strength has been kind of that it's fallen in the middle of all this. Yeah. Right? Like, it hasn't been... And it's
managed to, for the most part, avoid the noodly sort of things. Like, I never want to see, and I really don't like seeing, any sort of attributes where it's like, choose this to get a +1 bonus in this specific circumstance.
Yeah.
Like, we had that in 3rd edition and 4th edition, and we don't need that anymore. Like, that's not a thing. But had this cool extra thing that works all the time or that you can do. So, in that respect, channel nature and the wild shapes could be that for the Druid.
I think that as we kind of wrap this up, I think that as we look at the Paladin and the Druid, if we scrape away the things that we don't like and look at the design intent behind this, I actually think we're moving in a pretty good direction for balancing the game.
Yeah.
I do think that a lot of massaging needs to happen, especially with the Druid, because in trying to balance the game, we've stripped them of what I think made them one of the coolest classes to play. My desire to play a Druid in 5th edition was pretty high. In 1D&D, it's pretty low.
Yeah. We've already talked about how challenge rating is broken in 5th edition. And so when you have a player ability that says, choose a monster of challenge rating X, like,
yeah,
it's a broken system by default. So there shouldn't, we detaching the player abilities from anything that says, hey, player, choose a monster of challenge rating X or lower, that should just not be a thing, right? It's a good design choice. But at the same time, we still want to have that versatility and that expandability of these abilities.
Overall, I agree with those sentiments, and I do agree that bringing the Paladin and the Druid down a notch is actually something that we should be seeing in a new version of D&D. But I think that we need to maintain the creativity and the nuance and the sort of the fantasy that these classes fill needs to still be there, and they need to have that strong identity. And although the Paladin, I think more so, is pretty fine where it is, the Druid, I think that we need to be careful about how we move forward with this. And for the design team working on 1D&D, let's see some spiders, squirrels, and scorpions back in the playbook. So if you have any opinions on this play test that you want to let us know about, please tell us about it in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here, please consider becoming a patron of our show by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to see us playing 5th edition D&D, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more videos where we're discussing all the changes in 1D&D right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.